one thing I want to talk about today. One little thing. Was that too obvious? No, I feel like it wasn't. I felt like it was an appropriate joke. Yeah, I'm gonna stick with it. What up guys, Otterpop here, and welcome back to another forensics video. I haven't done one of these in a while, and I'm like, okay, well I kinda need to do another one soon, but it's kinda hard to, get all the information together and make sure I got all the pictures and the clips right. So I am back at it with another forensic video. I finally have the ability to do one, and I'm gonna be covering a topic today that if it wasn't obvious in either the title or the opening sequence, it's going to be as soon as I say it. Fingerprints. That's today's topic. Unless you have hands that are like, horribly scarred or something like that, everybody has fingerprints. And everybody also knows that no two fingerprints are alike, even on the same person, and even amongst twins. Can you believe that? Twins can share anything from like personalities to blood type and whatnot, or, blood. But the one thing that they do not share is fingerprints. So that's kind of interesting. And also, little fun fact, dog nose prints are also unique. Every single dog nose print is completely unique and different from every single other dog nose print. So that's pretty interesting. Everybody also knows a lot about the classification, the generic classification of a lot of fingerprints, but I'll be talking a little bit on that later. What people might not actually know is that the reason the fingerprints can be created is the furrows and ridges in the fingertips can accumulate amino acids and proteins and lipids, etc., and they can be transferred to another surface, hence how fingerprint impressions can be left behind and subsequently lifted, say at crime scenes. So it's useful when you see fingerprints in any kind of crime scene because, again, like I said, they're incredibly unique to every single individual, which means that sometimes fingerprints can be valuable information when trying to identify potential culprits at crime scenes. Today I'll be going over the two primary aspects of fingerprints, which is A, I love how I hold up a 1, but, fingers, but A, the locating and the lifting of fingerprints, and B, the comparison and analysis of fingerprints. Some of this information you might be familiar with, but I guarantee some of it you might not be. I'll start this off by saying that there are three primary types of fingerprint impressions. One is patent prints, and those are usually, those are visible to the naked eye. So say you have a fingerprint that was in blood or something, and then you just basically slap it right on a glass screen or something like that. That would be a patent print because you can see it with your naked eye without the aid of other tools. The second is a plastic print, which is an impression on a soft surface. So think of like you have a piece of clay and you decide to just, push your fingers right into that and just boom. And there you've got a little bit of fingerprint impressions on a little soft piece of clay. There's also a third type of print, which is probably the one people are most familiar with when it comes to forensics, which are Latin prints. They are invisible to the naked eye and usually require some kind of substance or fingerprint powder in order to locate them and subsequently lift them. Now, of course, there are a variety of ways that an initial search for fingerprints can be done. One is to use ambient light for a general search. And when I mean ambient light, I mean the sun coming from outside, or, this lamp that I have right here on my table. But using that sort of light to maybe see if there are any patent prints around, which, there's not usually just patent prints lying around, but hey, you never know. A second idea is to do a systematic search, so basically thinking about, okay, what is most likely to be touched or moved around in this scenario? So maybe it's a desk drawer, maybe it's a vase that was, moved around a little bit, maybe it's a doorknob. Those things are most likely to be touched and will most likely leave maybe some patent prints or latent prints as well. A third option is also using light at an angle, which is called oblique light. So for example, say this phone is a wall. I would basically shine a light and just kind of at an angle, because then you can see like a lot more of the dust and particles on said phone. Oh wow, that's actually a lot. I can see some fingerprints on there too. I guess I'm not surprised. But oblique lighting can help you better see some fingerprints and other types of particles on certain types of surfaces, so that's why it's useful. A fourth way of initially searching for fingerprints is to use an alternate light source, which is most often used with things like superglue and fluorescent powders, or like I was kind of taught in some of my classes using an orange screen with a blue light. Believe it or not, that can really help see a lot more of the particles than I initially thought. Like, holy moly! Look at all these little white spots on my friggin' desk alone. Maybe I should clean that. That's probably a good idea. but then a combination of using these methods with various types of substances, kind of like fingerprint powders and other types of powders and superglues and whatnot, allows you to document and collect said pieces of evidence. Now, most patent, plastic, and latent fingerprints you want to photograph, you want to lift if you have the ability to, and maybe even take the surface as well. You may not be able to, but say like you have a small little object where you found a fingerprint. Great! Make sure to collect that entire thing. But, you know, there's sometimes maybe like sections of the wall that may have something, and all you can really do is maybe photograph and lift it to the best of your ability. But there are various ways to collect and document fingerprints. It kind of all depends on what kind of print it is and the surface that it's located on. Now here comes the fun part that some people may actually already be a little familiar with, and that's, what do you use to even lift fingerprints in the first place? There are all different kinds of substances. Obviously, the most well-known one is fingerprint powder. Heck, I even have some right here too, from my forensics classes when I was in college. And I just spilled some on my hand on accident. Whoops. Oh no. Oh no. I just made it infinitely worse. Yeah, no. Stuff like that. It stains. But it's really good for fingerprint collection. Of course, black powder is probably the most known and probably one of the most frequently used fingerprint powders in order to lift fingerprints in the first place, but that doesn't mean it's the only one. One of my personal favorites is actually magnetic powder. It's very common, it's far less messy than regular black fingerprint powder. Magnetic powder is also even fairly well liked in the CSI community, and it's excellent for things like plastics and papers and some other surfaces, although for pretty obvious reasons it doesn't really work well with metals, but nothing is perfect. There's also another kind of powder called fluorescent powder, which is a lot finer of a powder to use. Usually you need an alternate light source in order to view it, but it is still there as an option. And believe it or not, but powders are not the only thing used to lift and collect fingerprints. There are also plenty of like little chemicals that are also used to achieve said process. Ashley's reagent, for example. A lot of people have probably never heard of it, but it's often used to enhance less visible blood impressions. Like with a lot of chemicals, you just kind of gently spray the reagent above the impression and let it just kind of run down over the impression, rinse with water after a couple of minutes, and boom, you've got a fingerprint. There are plenty of other little chemicals and reagents as well that worked. Some of them work better on other surfaces than others, but again, nothing is perfect. There are all different kinds of powders and reagents and chemicals that can be used for various reasons or for various surfaces, but they all exist for a good reason, and a lot of them are usually really good. There are also certain types of glues out there that exist, such as cyanoacrylate. I may have pronounced that wrong, but that's a bit of a tricky word to say, but cyanoacrylate acids, which can be used in sort of fume hoods, so basically you just kind of let the fumes run over like certain objects, or say under a fume hood, but you have to be careful because it is possible to overdevelop the prints. You can overdo it with stuff like that, but it can prove useful in providing some really good quality prints. So those are always potential options, if you're having trouble, that is. Usually most other powders and reagents can do the job before you necessarily need to do something like that, but again, it all depends on the situation and the surface. Anyways, that's the locating and lifting portion of the video, but now I want to move on to the second major topic, arguably more interesting, more diverse, and even slightly more fun topic, in a way, at least in my opinion, but hey, that's just me. The second portion I want to talk about is the comparison and analysis portion of fingerprints, at least in terms of forensics. Any kind of prints that are collected are compared to one another or compared to known sources by matching level 1, level 2, and level 3 details. Now, some of you are probably familiar with the level 1 details, the pattern and ridge flow, because there are 3 primary types of patterns in fingerprints, and that is loops, which are the most common of the fingerprint patterns, the whorls, which are the second most common, and the arches, which are the least common and a little bit rare compared to the other two. I unfortunately do not have any whorls to show anybody, but I actually do have 2 arches and 8 loops on my fingerprints. On my fingertips. One of my fingerprints actually is what is called, I didn't even know that this was a thing, it's called a double loop. So it's kind of like 2 loops kind of looping around each other in a weird sort of way. It's actually kind of interesting, but unfortunately my fingers are a little bit dry right now, so I really can't, and my camera's not specifically great, so I can't really do much with that, which is unfortunate. But, you know, look at your own fingers. Like, what do you possibly have on your fingers? Like, which one is it? People may also know a little bit about level 2 detail on fingerprints, what is called the minutia. So we're talking like bifurcations, enclosures, islands, ridge endings, hooks, deltas, bridges, crossovers. They're all different kinds of little minutia, but it's the combination of these minutia are what make so many fingerprints so varied and so diverse from one another. There's also level 3 detail. This is something that a lot of people may not actually know about. I honestly completely forgot about it until we discussed it in my forensics classes, but pores and ridge morphology is level 3 detail, and you're probably like, what the heck is that? Well, that's like all the little scars you have on your fingers, all the little random bumps you have, the width and shape of certain types of minutia, the deviation and the lengths, and so on and so forth. So it's kind of like minutia, but you know, the specifics of those minutia in a sense. But all 3 levels of detail are important to know of so that comparisons can be much more effective. But then say you got a whole bunch of prints that you collected from a crime scene, well, what the heck are you supposed to compare them to? Not just each other. Well, that's where IAFIS comes into play. IAFIS is basically an acronym for the Integrated Automated Fingerprint Identification System. A lot of people have probably heard of it, or maybe they like knew of it but didn't realize what it actually meant, but there's the acronym right for you. Basically, IAFIS is just a system that is full of nothing but fingerprints and identifications of those fingerprints, and IAFIS has various codes in the system to help identify prints, although not to say that everybody's prints are in the system. Typically only those in the law enforcement system, whether it's, you know, police officers or even, you know, criminals or whatnot, usually only their prints are actually in the entire system, which is a very small portion of, you know, everybody, but there are some people who do happen to have their prints in the system, but it's not a lot, so it's not always a lot to compare to. So basically, the comparison of fingerprints needs to be done by human eyes, which is actually a fairly biased process, believe it or not. In some of the videos that I've already done so far about forensics, at least recently, I have mentioned the show CSI in them, and CSI, oh boy, do they over-exaggerate fingerprints like nobody's business. It's absolutely insane. Not even just, you know, comparing them, because sometimes there will be a scene where they, you know, put a fingerprint into the system to compare it to other prints and they get a result in minutes. No, it takes a lot longer than that usually, and you don't always get the results that you're looking for. Sometimes you may even get, you know, false results, so you never know what's going to happen there. But the lifting and recording and collection of fingerprints in so many of the CSI episodes is so bothersome, and here's why. Later in my college years, I was in a class where we basically participated in a mock crime scene, with a mock trial afterwards. That was actually really fun, but during that time, I was actually the fingerprint lifter as well as the fingerprint examiner, and well, basically, I lifted and compared every single one of the prints involved in the entire mock crime scene. I lifted a total of 14 different prints, only 13 of which I could actually analyze. I can't remember why I couldn't analyze one of them, but I know that there was a good reason for it. Of the 14 prints, though, 8 of them were partial, and they weren't even close to detailed enough for me to compare with any other prints that were possibly given to us. 3 prints contained enough detail for a possible source identification, but that's just it, possible. And there were only 2 prints of the 14 that contained enough detail for a substantial amount of evidence for a positive source identification. And again, out of the 14 prints, only 2 of them were very viable, and 3 of others were only partially viable, so they weren't necessarily great, and they could have been significantly better, but more than half of them were just completely unusable. For most of the prints, I used magnetic powder because, well, it was a personal preference of mine, and frankly, it was a personal preference of a lot of the other students at the time, which I'm not really surprised about. It worked well on a lot of surfaces and was not very messy at all. There was one instance where I did use fluorescent powder on one of the items because it was a weird material, but I struggled trying to get a good photograph of it. and even when I used an alternative light source, so I had to get a little creative, and I ended up using just a tiny bit of magnetic powder on top of it, which I was able to successfully lift that and successfully analyze and compare it. If I'm recalling correctly, I believe that that was one of the 3 partials that I was able to kind of use as a good basis, but in retrospect, it was not. I'm just thinking about it nowadays, it was not a good idea to be a little bit creative with that, because that could have potentially destroyed some evidence, and it's just not the best idea necessarily. I mean, maybe some departments might say otherwise, I don't exactly know, but in retrospect, it was just not the best idea to get a little bit creative by using a combination of fluorescent and a little bit of magnetic powder in order to successfully lift a print. I was able to successfully lift it and successfully compare it afterwards, but it probably was not the best idea to be doing something like that. So, and again, I was able to, effectively use it. It's not like it was a bad print or anything, but it was just not a good idea for me to have done that. And I'm not sure why I did, but I did. And then, of course, my testimony in the mock trial was definitely extremely helpful, and I apparently did very well at that portion. And I was able to successfully lift and compare and analyze a variety of prints, which, probably would have made my testimony pretty damning, if I do say so myself. But even so, again, 14 prints, more than half of them were basically unusable, and 2 of them were really good, and 3 of them were partial and not as great but could still be useful. But even that's a little bit exaggerated for how it might be in crime scene investigations sometimes. You don't get a perfect print every single time. You don't succeed every single time, and you can put a print into IAFIS, but it might not recognize it. You might have to use human bias in order to compare it to other prints, and again, it may not even be a full print, so the comparison may not necessarily be the best one. There's not really much that you can do about it. There are just so many fingerprints. It's such a biased subject. I mean, it is getting better over time, don't get me wrong, but it's such a varied and biased subject that it's not always the easiest thing to do. It is kind of fun, but it's just not the easiest. So CSI can kiss my ass, because their ideas on collecting and lifting and comparing all kinds of fingerprints is just way over exaggerated. I mean, it might have been a little bit in the mock crime scene as well, but not quite to the same extent. But there's just a lot of information about fingerprints, about locating and lifting them, and even the subsequent comparison and analysis. At least those seem to be kind of the basics, so I hope you guys learned something. A lot of this stuff is actually really interesting. A lot of forensics in general is really interesting. Fingerprints included. Again, I've always loved fingerprints. I've loved how varied and diverse they are, but man, it can be complex with those subjects at times. Sometimes you may not even get fingerprints at a crime scene at all. It happens. But anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed this little video on fingerprints. Thank you all for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this little informative video. And as usual, until the next video, guys, check you laters.